Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 511, Tipping the Balance. When last we left things, the Ascendant Warrior class of Japan had become major players in the Kenmon system, the system of decentralized power centered on wealthy families or institutions who collectively managed the imperial state. Thanks to the Holguin and Heiji rebellions of 1156 and 1160, it had become clear to basically everyone that going forward, warrior power was going to matter a lot in terms of politics, and that you couldn't just assume said warriors would be easy to control for your own purposes. Indeed, those very warriors had shown a willingness to engage in shocking breaches of the non-violent rules of engagement that had dominated Kyoto politics for centuries. Previous competitions for power had been brutal, yes, but generally solved with an exile or two. Now, instead, palaces were being burned, heads were being displayed. There were, in essence, no rules anymore. And in this violent struggle, the man who had emerged on top was one Taira no Kiyomori, scion of the Kanmu Taira family, and after crushing the Minamoto and northern Fujiwara militarily, pretty much the undisputed master of Kyoto. After defeating his rivals in 1160, Taira no Kiyomori had busily set about securing the power of the Taira family, establishing it as the preeminent force in Kyoto politics. If the Kenmon system we talked about last week was all about rival families using their independent wealth and power to fight for control over the imperial administration, Kiyomori was able to fight those battles more effectively than pretty much anyone before him. He packed the imperial bureaucracy with allies and relatives, especially relatives because the politics of this time were grounded very much in familial alliances, and had himself promoted up the ranks of the state bureaucracy. In particular, in 1167, he became the first person outside of the elite families of the Kyoto aristocracy to be granted the title of Daijo Daijin, the Grand Counselor of State, and the highest position open to someone not from the imperial family. In 1171, he was able to take his prestige one step further. He arranged for his daughter, Taira no Tokuko, to enter the household of the then reigning emperor, the 12-year-old Takakura. 7 years later, the two would have a son, setting things up so that before long, a half-Taira emperor would be sitting on the throne. And indeed, in 1180, Kiyomori would see just that wish fulfilled, forcing the sitting emperor to abdicate in favor of his own grandson, known to history as Emperor Antoku, all of 2 years old at this point. This Taira ascendancy was secured by a key political alliance. Kiyomori's closest friend at court was the retired Emperor Go Shirakawa, a long-standing ally of the Kanmu Taira, as many a retired emperor before him had been. I think historian Andrew Goebel puts well what's important about all of this. Quote, Kiyomori realized that warriors now had a role in court politics and that he controlled those warriors. That said, he did not support greater authority for provincial warriors. Instead, he became a new stakeholder in the existing aristocratic polity, and he built the same type of patronage and family networks familiar to Kyoto power brokers. He obtained provincial governorships for himself and his supporters, acquired provincial land rights, built marriage ties to the imperial family, and seems to have seen new opportunities for wealth from trade overseas. In other words, Kiyomori did not try to leverage his control of the warrior class to upend the existing aristocracy. in favor of the warrior class as a whole. Instead, he simply wanted to add himself and his family to that existing aristocratic system as the first among equals. Naturally enough, though, his ambitions began to draw more and more resentment Kiyomori's way, as existing aristocrats came to resent the impediments to their own authority presented by a man who was, after all, not from a great family, and who relied on such brutish methods to seize power for himself. Kiyomori reacted to challenges to his authority with extreme harshness. A plot by members of the northern Fujiwara to oust him in 1177 was broken up when it was reported to his supporters, and the ringleaders were either placed under permanent house arrest or publicly beheaded. Over time, even the retired Emperor Go Shirakawa began to express concern about Kiyomori's power. He'd become increasingly concerned about his erstwhile ally Kiyomori, and come to see Taira power as a threat to his regime. Kiyomori responded to this concern by placing the retired emperor under house arrest as well, essentially launching a coup of his own to secure complete control of the Kyoto government. He later moved to secure his power by attempting to relocate the capital out of Kyoto for the first time in centuries, following the footsteps of predecessors like Emperor Kanmu, who had hoped that by moving the center of administration closer to their own base of power, they could exercise even greater degrees of control over the state. Specifically, Kiyomori attempted to relocate the capital to Fukuhara-kyo, now more or less Kobe, just northwest of Osaka. The move did not go well, to put it mildly. The site was too cramped to fit some of the necessary buildings and too wet from storms blowing in from the inland sea. The project was abandoned in less than 6 months in favor of a return to Kyoto, but the attempt itself showed the lengths to which Kiyomori would go for power. And it wasn't really like anyone could effectively challenge him at this point. Just before the relocation of the capital, and in fact this was one of the inciting incidents for the move, a young prince of the imperial line named Mochihito, the son of Go Shirakawa, had attempted his own strike against the Taira. Prince Mochihito sent a missive out to the other warrior families of Japan, calling on them to join him in destroying Kiyomori, who had usurped the dignity of the imperial throne. The message fell largely on deaf ears. Outside of the Taira, very few warrior families had much of a stake at all in the court politics of Kyoto, so why would they join a rebellion that could cost so much when they didn't have that much to gain? Besides, it wasn't like victory looked very likely. Mochihito also sent his appeal to the powerful monasteries of central Japan, particularly the feuding temples of Enryakuji and Miidera at Mount Hiei, and the great temples of Nara. These temples, too, were powerful players in the Kenmon system. They were wealthy in their own right thanks to their shoen grants, and even had armed followers to defend their claims. However, when several of the monasteries of Nara as well as Miidera did take up arms against Taira no Kiyomori, they were crushed by the Taira in a battle near modern Uji, southeast of Kyoto, and Kiyomori responded by burning Miidera and a good chunk of Nara to the ground. Prince Mochihito himself was killed in the fighting. So Taira power did not look very shakeable at all, except for one of those funny little twists of fate. Remember how 2 of the children of the old Minamoto clan leader Yoshitomo had been spared execution and were still alive? Well, the elder sibling, Minamoto no Yoritomo, was still out east in the Kanto in 1180 with the Hojo clan, a Taira ally to whom he'd been entrusted to make sure he didn't make trouble. Yoritomo was clever and charismatic, and his erstwhile captor Hojo Tokimasa liked him enough that eventually he'd allowed Yoritomo to marry his own daughter, Hojo Masako. Now, Yoritomo was theoretically disempowered. He was away from his family, surrounded by Taira loyalists in the distant east far from the center of power. But this, in fact, turned out to be an asset. Yoritomo had 20 years to familiarize himself with the politics and concerns of warrior society in the remote Kanto plains, divorced from the goings-on of the Kyoto government, about which these warriors cared very little in practice. This familiarity with the warriors of the East, plus his distinguished lineage and his marriage to Masako, were all substantial assets when news of Prince Mochihito's call to arms reached the east, well after the prince himself had already died fighting the Taira. Yoritomo began to use this call to arms to make the case to his fellow eastern provincial warriors that Mochihito's call to arms was a valuable opportunity for them. The warriors of the East, with him as their leader naturally, could use this as a pretext to construct a new order where united samurai families of the oft-neglected eastern provinces could come together and become a political force in their own right, and use their power to protect the property rights and alliances they built their strength upon from interference by a court that only ever used them for its own ends. This message, nobody in Kyoto cares about you, but together under my rule we can make them care, found a willing audience. Admittedly, and understandably given how previous military efforts against the Taira went, finding warriors willing to fight against the Taira proved a bit of a challenge at first. The very first battle between Yoritomo's allies and a Taira force sent to deal with them, in the foothills of Mount Fuji in the late summer of 1180, ended in a Taira victory, with the Minamoto forces driven from the field by superior numbers. However, Yoritomo was able to make a fighting retreat and gather more allies from the mountainous interior of the east, in particular the Takeda clan, a name we will hear more of in the future, and with their help, Yoritomo was able to counterattack and drive the Taira forces from the east in the fall. That victory in turn gave him breathing room to secure his position in the east among the clans of the area. From a home base in the village of Kamakura, Yoritomo began to assemble a following of eastern clans who, now that he had proven he could win, were increasingly willing to listen to what he had to say. The resulting conflict is known to history as the Genpei War, a combination of the Chinese readings for the characters for Minamoto, Gen, and Taira, Hei or Pei. This is also, by the way, why you sometimes see the Minamoto called the Genji, a Chinese-style reading of the characters for Minamoto clan, and the Taira, the Heike, a Chinese-style reading of Taira family. For consistency, I'm going to use Minamoto and Taira going forward. From this point in the Genpei War, pretty much everything came up Minamoto. Yoritomo himself was a better administrator than a commander, but his cause was helped substantially by the reemergence of his younger half-brother Yoshitsune, the one who had been carted off to a monastery. Minamoto no Yoshitsune is such a titanic figure of legend and literature, and his exploits have been so thoroughly mythologized that it's often hard for the non-expert to sort fact from reality. And that task is entirely beyond the scope of this podcast. For us, it's important simply to note that the historical Yoshitsune was pretty clearly a good field commander, and that with his help, Yoritomo and the Minamoto side were able to score a series of decisive victories over the Taira. By this point, Kiyomori himself was long gone from the scene. He had taken ill in late 1180 shortly after defeating the temples which had joined Prince Mochihito's rebellion, and died shortly thereafter. His death was cast by some as an instance of karmic punishment for attacking Buddhist institutions. In the famous dramatization of this period, Heike Monogatari, he is racked with a literally hellish fever that cannot be cooled, and which burns all who come near him before his death, reflecting the sure punishment he will experience in Naraka, the Buddhist realm equivalent to hell. Somewhat over-the-top depictions of his death notwithstanding, without Kiyomori's leadership the Taira suffered badly. His heir, Taira no Munemori, proved both a lot less adept as a commander and much worse as a politician, and under his leadership Taira forces collapsed swiftly, even though the Minamoto themselves splintered during the war, with some coming to back Yoritomo's cousin Yoshinaka, who declared war separately against the Taira and was actually the first to drive them from Kyoto. Yoritomo cleverly allowed Yoshinaka to handle the bulk of the fighting against the Taira, while he concentrated on strengthening his own hold over the families of the East, and then swooped in to crush Yoshinaka after his cousin had done the hard work of seizing Kyoto. Now, there is a lot of complexity to this conflict, and avid listeners of the podcast or readers of Heike Monogatari will know I am skipping over a lot. But the upshot is that by 1185 the Taira clan was annihilated. Its final stand was at Dan-no-ura near the Straits of Shimonoseki, dividing Kyushu from Honshu, where the Taira had fled with the boy emperor Antoku and one of the pieces of the imperial regalia, Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the sword. Supposedly, when it was clear the battle was lost, Taira no Kiyomori's widow, Tokiko, took the then 7-year-old boy and the sword and jumped into the water, drowning them both and taking the sword with them. There are various legends about the sword magically returning itself to Kyoto. More than likely, it was simply replaced. The death of the Taira leadership brought the war to a close. Minamoto no Yoritomo was now the most powerful warrior in Japan, and thanks to the coalition of Eastern warriors he had constructed, arguably, he was the most powerful man in the country flat out. And this is really the most important thing about Minamoto no Yoritomo. Again, he wasn't a great military commander. Not a terrible one, but not great. But he was a smart, if ruthless politician, and he carefully handed out prizes and honors to his followers to build a network of personal relationships which supported his own rule. More ruthlessly, he was not the type to make Kiyomori's mistake and show mercy to anyone from the Taira clan, even if they were young. After all, who knew better than him how that sort of mercy can come back to haunt you later? He even turned on his own half-brother Yoshitsune after the war ended, who had been his most able commander, and who for that reason had to be crushed after the war, lest Yoshitsune's popularity prove a threat to his rule. Yoritomo spent 7 years after the fall of the Taira cleaning up little threats to his rule like this, and waiting for the retired emperor Go Shirakawa, the last political counterweight to his influence, to die. When Go Shirakawa finally did in early 1192, Yoritomo took advantage to begin pressuring the new head of the imperial line, the retired emperor Go-Toba, to grant Yoritomo a new position. Specifically, Yoritomo received the title of shogun, that old position used to indicate commanders for the armies subjugating the Amishi tribes of the north, but made use of it in a new way. This would not be a temporary appointment. Yoritomo would hold it until his death in 1199 and arranged for it to be passed to his son, and it was to be an administrative role, not a military one. Yoritomo is thus the founder of Japan's first bakufu, literally tent government, a term that refers to the various governments established by the shoguns of Japan. We call his government specifically the Kamakura Bakufu or Kamakura Shogunate, after the eastern outpost that had become the Minamoto family headquarters during the Genpei War. Now, the government structure Yoritomo set up was pointedly not designed to completely displace the existing one in Kyoto. Like Kiyomori before him, Yoritomo saw a value in maintaining the existence of the old system and using it to legitimate his own rule. Instead, Yoritomo used his new title and the administration he built to carve out more political power for the warrior class, and to dispense power and rewards to his followers to ensure their loyalty. If we return to the language of previous episodes, Yoritomo is setting himself up as the master of a new kenmon, a powerful independent institution with himself as its head, and using that independent power to control aspects of the government in Kyoto to his own advantage. For example, one of the concessions Yoritomo was able to wrest from the Kyoto government for saving them from Taira domination was the ability to appoint shugo, or military governors, to Japan's 60 provinces. Ostensibly, these shugo would be parallel figures to each province's kokushi, the provincial governor appointed by the civilian government in Kyoto. The kokushi would handle matters of civilian interest, taxation being the most important, while the shugo would handle military issues like banditry and manage the needs of the local samurai population. In practice, of course, the line between civil and military affairs was not always clear, and clashes between civilian kokushi governors and military shugo ones were not uncommon, with the result generally favoring the military side. Similarly, Yoritomo was empowered to appoint jito, or stewards, to the nation's tax-free shogun estates. These jito stewards, often chosen from the ranks of Yoritomo's own vassals, were tasked with maintaining law and order in the estates, whose smooth functioning and regular supply of taxes were, after all, essential to the needs of Yoritomo and the government more broadly. Theoretically, the Jito were supposed to work with the existing power holders in the states, the shoen holders and their appointed managers, to make sure things went smoothly. Practically, the Jito often butted heads with shoen owners, and once again, they usually came out on top. What Yoritomo is setting up with moves like this is, in essence, a two-tiered government split between the civilian center in Kyoto and the military one in Kamakura. While over time the military side would come to dominate politics in an increasing number of ways, the civilian government would not be totally disempowered, at least not yet. However, Yoritomo's two-tiered government would not remain long in the hands of his family, the Seiwa Minamoto. After his death in 1199, power would swiftly slip away from the Minamoto clan. And to talk about why, we have to talk about some good old-fashioned family politics. You might recall that one of the most important parts of Yoritomo's rise to power was his relationship to his marital family, the Hojo clan, one of the eastern warrior clans of the Kanto. Yoritomo had been entrusted as a boy to Hojo Tokimasa, the head of the Hojo clan, and a long-standing political ally of Taira no Kiyomori, the thinking being that as Kiyomori's longtime ally, Tokimasa could be trusted to keep an eye on the boy and make sure he didn't cause trouble. And at first, this worked, but over the course of the 1170s, Tokimasa's loyalties began to shift. It's a bit unclear why. It's not like he kept a diary or anything to talk about his political feelings, or if he did, we don't have it. Likely one of the inciting incidents was the marriage of his daughter, Hojo Masako, who actually ignored her father's initial wishes to Yoritomo in the late 1170s. Again, we don't have much in the way of sources here in terms of the interpersonal dynamics as to what led Masako or Tokimasa to start seeing Yoritomo as an ally. For example, one of the more complete primary sources of this period, the Azuma Kagami, begins in 1180 and describes Tokimasa as already loyal to Yoritomo at that point. We can certainly theorize. It seems likely that both Masako and Tokimasa gradually began to view Yoritomo as useful given his charisma, political talents, and his elite pedigree as a part of the Seiwa Minamoto family. Regardless, by the time of the Genpei War, the Hojo clan had firmly switched sides to Yoritomo and the Minamoto. Tokimasa and Masako were Yoritomo's closest advisors during the war. They would remain so until his death, when a funny thing started to happen. You see, Yoritomo had two sons by Masako by the time he died. Yoriie, the eldest, was 17. Sanetomo, the youngest, was 7. Neither was quite ready for the reins of power, so Yoritomo's death triggered a crisis of leadership within the shogunate, which lasted for a quarter of a century. You see, the shogunate had already proven its value in just 7 years as a vehicle for the influence of Eastern warrior families over politics. But said families were also notoriously independent and jealous of one another, and both disinclined to listen to young kids, and to allow one of their own to replace Yoritomo. After all, they were all supposed to be equals. So, okay, that's fine, we can just prop the kids up as a symbol to replace their dad in the role of shogun, but that still leaves a problem. They're kids. They'll need a guiding hand to ensure they're able to manage things, so who's the guiding hand going to be? That question would take decades to solve, and the answers would involve a not insubstantial amount of violence. To start with, the eldest of Yoritomo's sons, Yoriie, assumed the mantle of shogun after his father's passing. At 17, he was at least nearing adulthood and conveniently already had a son, the 1-year-old Minamoto no Ichiman. He was also a talented warrior with a substantial interest in fencing and archery, which would prove useful for impressing his potential followers. But his heir and his marriage were also a point of controversy. His wife, Wakasa no Tsubone, was the daughter of Hiki Yoshikazu, head of one of those elite warrior families of the East, the Hiki. And that relationship, along with Yoriie's youth, led to concerns that Yoriie's role as shogun wasn't really to rule, but to serve as a conduit for influence on the part of the Hiki clan. That worry was particularly prominent for Hojo Masako and Hojo Tokimasa, who were worried about losing influence over their son/grandson, respectively, in favor of his marital family. And so they arranged a coalition of anti-Hiki families who worked against Hiki influence. Ultimately, Tokimasa would decide to deal with the problem permanently by inviting Hiki Yoshikazu to a meeting in 1203 to talk things over, smooth things out, and then assassinating him when he arrived. At the same time, Tokimasa had the shogun himself placed under house arrest for his own protection, while a Hojo-led coalition destroyed the Hiki permanently. Tokimasa's own great-grandson and Yori-Ie's son, Minamoto no Ichiman, who, as tradition dictated, was with his maternal family at this time, was killed in the fighting at the age of 6. Yori-Ie obviously did not take this great and died under mysterious circumstances, almost certainly also killed by his own grandfather, the next year. So okay, that one didn't go great, but Yoritomo had another son, Sanetomo. At this point, he's 12, a bit older. We can put him up as shogun. This time it should work fine, right? And it did, sort of. You see, at this point, the Hojo clan started turning on each other, with Tokimasa and his daughter Masako each becoming convinced the other was planning to cut them out of political power. Masako acted first, and in 1205 launched a mini-coup of her own with her brother's backing to remove her father from his positions and take the reins of government for herself. Masako, through her son, would largely be calling the shots on behalf of the Hojo going forward, spending the next few years cooking up pretexts to remove the other warrior families of the East she saw as a threat, or at least as insufficiently pliable to her rule. But then, in 1219, disaster struck again. While in Kamakura visiting his family's shrine, Tsurugaoka Hachiman Shrine, the shogun Sanetomo was killed. Who killed him, you ask? His own nephew. You see, Yori-Ie, the previous shogun, actually had 2 sons. The older Ichiman was killed, but the younger one, who was 3 when his maternal family was purged, was not, and was instead packed off to a monastery where presumably he would be no trouble. Packing people off to monasteries does not, for the record, seem to work as a method for getting them to not make trouble. So this boy would grow into a monk known to history by his monastic name, Kugyo. His birth name, Minamoto no Yoshinari, is far less commonly used. In 1219, Kugyo took it upon himself to avenge his brother, father, and maternal family by killing his uncle Sanetomo. Shortly thereafter, he was apprehended and executed himself. Now, it has long been suspected there was some foul play here, that Kugyo was pushed to remove Sanetomo by one or another member of the Hojo family, who had found this boy too insufficiently pliable. In particular, it's sometimes suspected that Hojo Yoshitoki, Masako's brother, was behind the whole thing. He was supposed to be with Sanetomo when the assassination happened, but begged off at the last minute due to an illness, which is kind of suspicious. But then again, his motives are also unclear, and Kugyo also killed Sanetomo's bodyguard, whom he believed was Yoshitoki. Honestly, we can't really be sure what happened, but once again, we have a problem regardless, and this time, there's no easy fix. Thanks to Yoritomo killing his own half-brother decades ago and Sanetomo's relative youth, he had no children yet, we now both need a new shogun and are out of direct patrilineal descendants of the Seiwa Minamoto line. So we're right back where we started, with a crisis of leadership and with no easy fix to boot, because we are now just flat out of choices for an easy replacement shogun. Now, the Kamakura shogunate will endure past this point, and there are a few different reasons for why that we can point to. The collective interest of the Eastern warrior families in preserving it, or prominent civil officials who had come from Kyoto to Kamakura to serve the shogunate, and who had an interest in protecting it. However, there's one figure I think deserves the lion's share of the credit, and of course, she is Hojo Masako, who at this point is the only person who has been consistently in power from the start of the Genpei War in 1180 to now. The eldest of her father's 15 children, she was also clearly a deeply shrewd political figure. The Azuma Kagami relates that she helped rally the clans of the East to support Yoritomo in the first place, and of course she worked with her own brother to remove her father from office when he became a threat to her position. And when, after Sanetomo's death, the Kamakura shogunate was in crisis, she was the one who guided it through. Over the intervening decades, a new power holder had emerged in Kyoto while the shogunate was sorting itself out. This was Go-Toba, whom Yoritomo had put on the imperial throne after the seizure of Kyoto from the Taira-backed emperor Antoku. Like his predecessors before him, Go-Toba had reigned for a time before abdicating, and as retired emperor, set about trying to rebuild the independent power of the imperial house, which had been stripped away by Taira no Kiyomori. Naturally, he was not a big fan of how much power the Minamoto had aggregated to themselves, and when Sanetomo died, he saw a chance to weaken the shogunate as an institution. He used his influence in Kyoto to block the appointment of a new shogun, since the job technically had to be granted by the emperor, and began plotting a rebellion against the nascent warrior government, which began in 1221. And when this happened, it was Masako who, in the absence of a shogun, held the warrior families together. After all, her closeness to Yoritomo and her own intelligence meant they all respected her. It was Masako who, when word of Go-Toba's attempted rebellion reached Kamakura, rallied the warrior clans against him to defend the shogunate, and who convinced fence-sitters debating jumping over to the retired emperor's side to stick with the shogunate. She was thus a central figure in the defeat of Go-Toba's rebellion, known as the Jokyu Rebellion after the era name of the time, and the exile of the troublemaking retired emperor and his allies from Kyoto, to be replaced by more pliably pro-Hojo choices. It turned out that the Kamakura shogunate was without a shogun for 7 years, from 1219 to 1226. But in the interim, I think it's fair to say Hojo Masako filled the role in everything but name. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. After her husband's death, she had taken the vows of a Buddhist nun, and one of the nicknames for her is Ama Shogun, the nun shogun. Masako would die in 1225, and the very next year, a more pliant replacement emperor would name a new shogun. However, that shogun would not come from the Hojo family. The title had to go to someone with an appropriately high aristocratic pedigree, and while the Minamoto family did have that by virtue of their distant imperial ancestry, the Hojo were provincial warriors and manifestly did not. But that was okay. The system that the Hojo family, led by Masako's nephew Yasutoki at this point, came up with, had a fix in mind for that problem. From this point to the end of the Kamakura shogunate, the position of shogun would rotate through a series of aristocrats appointed from Kyoto, members of one or another Fujiwara branch or imperial princes. Most were children. The first of these shoguns from a branch of the Fujiwara was 7 years old when he took the title. And as that might imply, these shoguns were mere puppets. Again, they were mostly children and they held no real power. Instead, governance was the job of a regent for the shogun, a shikken in Japanese, who always came from the Hojo family. The whole arrangement is very similar to the system used by the northern Fujiwara in the 900s, with puppet emperors ruled by their own regents. Thus, the shogun himself was a figurehead, in reality the Hojo clan called the shots. And this was the version of the Kamakura government that would endure for the next century, Japan's first stable samurai government. Now, not to belabor this point too much, but I really do want to emphasize that this warrior government, though it is fair to say that it's the most powerful political force of its time, did not dominate politics completely. The Kyoto court continued to operate, as did the civilian government of the provinces, which existed going back to the Taika reforms half a millennium earlier. So in a certain sense, the whole parallel government structure of the time did work. The structure of the Kamakura shogunate is complicated, and it's not even clear what some aspects of the bureaucracy were for, but broadly its main concern seems to have been adjudicating disputes between or involving samurai and protecting their legal claims to property, especially valuable shogun estates. That function didn't necessarily need to disrupt the ongoing Kyoto-based government. But at the same time, speaking broadly, whenever civilian and military interests butted heads, the latter came out on top, be it in military conflicts like the Jokyu Rebellion or more minor legal disputes. This parallel government structure can, as I think we're starting to see, be a bit confusing. We're going to be dealing with it for a few more episodes yet, so it's worth trying to wrap our heads around. But fortunately, next week we're going to take a brief detour while it all sinks in, and take a look at something rather different: the massive changes sweeping the religious landscape during the dawn of medieval Japan. But that's for next week. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shout-out tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, Harrison Reese, Robbie Martin McAvoy, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks also to new donor to History of Japan Patreon Edward for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week as we turn our attention to religion and Buddhism in medieval Japan.